Hey everyone, I'm Tara Lynn of Geek Saga Entertainment, and welcome to the Geek Saga Show's solo podcast series, Impulsive Hyperfocus. First things first, you can follow me at A Geek Saga on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, or Threads for insight into my life and, of course, updates about this and other Geek Saga entertainment endeavors. And if you want early access to these and other podcast-only recordings, links to personal Spotify playlists, show notes, writing samples, and more, check out the Geek Saga Entertainment Patreon at patreon.com/geeksaga_entertainment. Also, if you're listening to this on a podcatcher, especially Spotify or Apple Podcasts, we really appreciate 5-star reviews. They do help us get noticed a little bit more, so please go ahead and leave one of those 5-star reviews for us. Before I dig in, I wanted to note that this episode is my second episode about our trip to Japan. So if you haven't listened to the first one yet, make sure to check out Geek Saga Podcast, episode 126. Also, I always start these Impulsive Hyperfocus episodes by highlighting one thing about myself. Generally, it's something that's at least sort of related to what I'm covering in the episode. I went back and forth about what to highlight for this one, but in the end, I think it makes the most sense to touch on when I first started working for Disney. I did the Walt Disney World College program way back in 2001, and you can actually hear a whole lot more about that in a bunch of my previous Geek Saga podcast episodes. It's episodes 41, 42, 46, 50, 51, and 52. But for the purposes of this episode, the important thing is that my college program coincided with the opening of Tokyo Disney Sea. To be fair, from what I remember, people kind of bombed Tokyo Disney Sea at first. I'll get into my thoughts on both Tokyo Disney parks later in this episode, but I have to say that it was really fun to visit a park that opened while I was a cast member, even if it was, of course, in the US. In fact, I'm kind of glad that I never got rid of the commemorative coin they gave to all cast members who were working at that time. Truth be told, I always thought it was a dumb gift, but it's still neat to say that 23-ish years later, I finally got to see the park that I received a cast member exclusive item for. Of course, that wasn't even close to being the coolest thing about visiting the Tokyo Disney parks. Not by a long shot. But again, I'll get into my experiences there soon. First, however, I'm most excited to talk about what was by far my favorite thing to do in Japan in Chapter 5, Maneki Neko, Kitsune, and Komainu. Oh my! In case you don't know what I'm referencing, I'll go into Terra mode for a minute here and explain. Maneki Neko, Kitsune, and Komainu are guardians of the shrines and temples. Maneki Neko, aka the fortune-telling, Kunan, beckoning cat, or lucky cat, is specific to Gotokuji Temple, while Kitsune, the fox guardian, is specific to Shinto shrines dedicated to Inari, and Komainu are the lion dogs that guard both Shinto shrines and Buddhist temples. Anyway, visiting a total of 8 amazing shrines and temples was, as I said, my favorite overall part of our trip. Oh, and before we went, a friend told me how addicting it was to collect goshuin, which are the stamps or seals that are unique to each place of worship. And I'm a bit ashamed to admit that I brushed this off until we went to our first temple and I bought a Goshuin Show, one of the special books for Goshuin, and collected my first stamp and was immediately hooked. And I definitely spent a lot of time collecting these throughout the week, but as fun as that was, and as much as I loved the experience of collecting them, the really important thing was actually seeing these places. And as luck would have it, sort of pun, definitely intended, the first temple we got to see was Gotokuji, which is believed to have been the birthplace of the Maneki Neko. We didn't actually get there until the second full day of our trip, and it did involve 2 separate trains, adding up to a total of about 45 or 50 minutes each way from Shinjuku, plus a 10 to 15 minute walk from the train station to the temple. But it was so worth the trip that I highly, highly suggest anyone going to Tokyo for more than a couple of days, make it a point to visit this temple. It was especially beautiful with the fall leaves and is one of those places I think that you have to see and experience to truly understand its beauty. The thing about Gotokuji, as compared to most of the other shrines and temples we visited, is that the grounds are very spacious, and on top of that, it wasn't crowded. Of course, the lack of crowds probably had to do with the fact that we visited around midday on a Monday in early December. And we did have to wait in a bit of a line to purchase some Maneki Neko figurines, but overall, it was probably the most peaceful afternoon we had in Japan. And not just peaceful, enjoyable, meaningful, almost, I don't know. This probably sounds corny, I guess, but in a way, it was magical. All of those little beckoning cats, so many of them left with messages, everything from a child wishing for a pet rabbit to people mourning losses, a parent expressing the desire for their children to be happy, someone dreaming for world peace. I don't know. I'm honestly getting chills again just thinking about it. And I don't want to get choked up because I feel that coming on too. Plus, I have 6 other shrines and temples to mention, so I'll move on to my second favorite, although this one was much harder to determine. It was between Meiji Jingu and Gojoten, with the latter winning out simply because I loved how it is nestled off to the side of Ueno Park. And while I wouldn't say that Gojoten is maze-like per se, I loved the tunnel of Torii gates leading into it from the park side entrance. I loved the fact that it's built on a small hillside, and also that despite being located in what is arguably Tokyo's most famous park, it was still quiet and serene. As for Meiji Jingu, it's not in a park, but it is next to one. It's next to Yoyogi Park. And the 2 main gates to Meiji Jingu have these wide forested paths that lead to the shrine. And honestly, those paths and the gigantic Torii gates at the entrances to both of them are worth seeing all on their own, especially again with the fall leaves. It was just so beautiful. And thankfully, while Meiji Jingu was fairly crowded when we went, it's so large that it didn't feel anywhere near as congested as, for instance, the Sensoji Temple. That said, everything about Meiji Jingu was so, large. And if it's not obvious already, I preferred the more intimate shrines and temples. The others that we went to included, of course, Sensoji, which is a Buddhist temple, as well as the Asakusa Jinja shrine next to it, the Toshogu shrine, which is in Ueno Park along with Gojoten, the Hanetzono shrine in Shinjuku, and the Hakone Jinju shrine located on Lake Ashinoko, a couple to few hours outside of Tokyo. But I'm going to be talking about the Hakone Golden Route as a whole in a little bit, so I'm going to leave my thoughts on that particular shrine for later in the episode. So, as mentioned, Sensoji was extremely crowded, and to be honest, the incense smoke and smell of the incense was somehow permeating the air, yes, on the outside grounds, but I did love the little gardens around the temple. And the neat thing about the Asakusa Jinja shrine that's next to Sensoji is that it was one of just 2 buildings in the area to survive World War II, which sadly Sensoji did not. Toshogu, the other Ueno Park shrine, was one that we only saw briefly from the outside. If you've done any research or have been to Japan or Tokyo, it's best known for being the shrine that's covered in gold, which was always going to be a bit, I'll just say a little bit much for my taste. So I don't really have a lot to say about it. And lastly, Hanetzono, which was just a couple of blocks from our hotel, was sadly under construction, but we still really enjoyed visiting it for a couple of reasons. First, there is a sub-shrine there that has a little pathway of Torii gates leading up to it, and it's also an Inari Fox shrine. I really wish there hadn't been fencing and stuff around it, but even with the fencing, it was still just a really neat experience to walk down that path under all of those little Torii gates and reach the end and have this little shrine with all of these fox statues around it. I really loved it, and I only wish that it hadn't been under construction. But anyway, plus there is a regular market that is set up around the shrine with people selling all sorts of antiques and souvenirs. So it was really neat getting to experience that when we dropped by the shrine on our last afternoon in Japan, which was a Sunday, by the way. And we'd noted the market the previous Sunday, which was our first full day in Japan. So if you're in that area on a Sunday, I hope you're getting the hint regarding what my to-do suggestion would be. Anyway, yes, I know I kind of rushed through talking about those last few shrines and temples, but that's because I still have so much to talk about, including another of my top 3 trip activities, meaning it's time for Chapter 6, A Course of Gold and Conveyance. You know, I came up with the name for this chapter a while back, and now that I'm saying it out loud, I realize how much it sounds like the title of a YA novel. Exhausted but somehow still plucky protagonist goes on an epic journey, but will they complete their expedition in time? I mean, I know that's a bit rough, but I am putting myself on the spot here. Also, wow, I need to get back on track. So, remember how just a few minutes ago, well, ish anyway, I mentioned that I wanted to talk about our Hakone experience as a whole? Well, that's what this chapter is all about, because we spent one very long day, though in the end, not actually quite long enough, completing the Hakone Golden Course, or route. Apparently, the latter is the more popular name, but I swear I saw it referred to as a course more than a route when I was in Japan. Of course, puns. That's neither here nor there. What's important is that I went into this day not blind, but maybe like if you're one of those people who only needs reading glasses, which isn't me because my contact prescription is -9 with an astigmatism, but Jesus, that's neither here nor there either, I guess. Point being, I did some research, but not really enough, especially not before I booked our romance car tickets. But that is getting a bit ahead of myself because I do want to explain what the Golden Course route, whatever you want to call it, is. Honestly, your experience really depends on the amount of time you're willing and or able to spend on it. Don't get me wrong, we had an amazing day getting out to Hakone and back, and really that's the biggest part of the whole adventure because you start by taking the Shinkansen from Tokyo to Yamato, or from Kyoto to Yamato because it's apparently easily accessible from there as well. We spent a little extra on the romance car, which has large windows that make for a near panoramic view. And you also get to choose your seats. Granted, our ride back to Tokyo was in the dark, so the view didn't matter that much. But if you're doing the romance car to get there, you might as well also do it to get back. I want to say it only cost about $30 extra per person round trip. Just definitely book your tickets ahead of time. I believe they open for purchase either 1 month or 30 days prior to your travel date. And yes, there's a difference there. But yeah, I can't remember exactly which it is. It's either 1 month or 30 days. The romance car carried us to Hakone Yamato Station, where we switched to the Hakone Tozen Railway, which is one of just a handful of mountain railways in Japan, featuring these quaint little train cars and several switchbacks offering great views as you wind up the mountainside to the next type of conveyance. This time it was in Gora, where we transferred to a cable car that climbs up quite an incline until it ends at Sunzen Station. From here, we took the Hakone Ropeway over the volcanic valley and all the way to its end at Lake Ashi. Now, there is a whole round trip version of the Golden Route that involves buses, I believe, either at the beginning or the end. You can do it either way, of course, hence round trip. But we didn't quite do that because we just took the pirate ships across Lake Ashi and back, and then did all of the aforementioned conveyances backwards all the way back to Tokyo. Okay, now that I've gotten the basics out of the way, and yes, I know that's a lot of basics, this is where I mentioned that I flubbed when booking our romance car times. I had seen several sites that claimed you can have the whole Hakone experience in just 6 to 8 hours, and I suppose that's true, sort of. But not counting the time it took us to get to and from Tokyo, we had about 7.5 hours, and I definitely wish we'd had at least 2 hours more. Also, other than having to wait for the pirate ship to take us from the ropeway and to actual Hakone across the lake, I think we waited about 30 minutes at that station slash pier, whatever you want to call it. We really got lucky because every other time we just walked right on, whether it be a ship, a ropeway, a cable car, or a train. So yeah, if you're going out there, you're going to be rushed even if you get lucky. And we had taken just about the earliest train from Tokyo that I could stand. We left at about 7:30 a.m. from Shinjuku, but we definitely should have booked a later return, say 7 or 7:30 p.m. instead of 5 p.m. because yeah, again, we did get to go all the way to Hakone and even briefly visit the Hakone Shrine, but I would have loved more time at the shrine, mainly to get a proper picture at the floating torii and also more time to explore the town of Hakone. Not to mention that there's a second shrine that's a bit of a longer walk from the pirate ship dock in Hakone, plus stops you can make along both the ropeway and cable car for viewing spots, an open air museum, and a mountainside garden, all of which we had to skip. And the little town of Yamato is really cute, and I definitely would have liked more time there, too. Thankfully, we did get some photos near the Hakone Shrine's floating torii, and I had time to get my Goshuin. We also made brief stops, very brief, on our return trip on the ropeway, first to see the display of the original ropeway cars, and then at the main station, Owakudani, to buy some of the black eggs and eat some black curry buns. P.S. The latter were delicious, but the eggs were not my cup of tea. We also had about 45 minutes in Yamato before we had to board the romance car back to Tokyo, which allowed us to do a little bit of window shopping and grab some street food. But again, I definitely wish we'd had more time than that. And that was our Golden Route day. I am really glad that we got out of the city and had this experience, even if the latter part of the day was far more rushed than I would have liked. Thankfully, we did have enough time on our next full day escapade, the third of my top 3, and the subject of Chapter 7, The Kingdom of Dreams and Magic. Why, yes, I'm finally getting around to our long and lovely day spent at Tokyo Disneyland and Disney Sea. As I mentioned in my first Japan episode, which, again, in case you haven't listened to it, is episode 126 of this podcast, we booked a bus trip via Klook that went direct from Shinjuku Station to the Disney parks, at least in the morning. It's different getting back in the evening because you have to take public transportation or, I guess, a rideshare or whatever, but that's really expensive. Anyway, so the bus that we took got us there right around 8:15 a.m. or so, which meant about a 45-minute wait until the park opened. It was a bit boring and very chilly, but I honestly don't know if I've ever done a rope drop before. If I have, it definitely wasn't any time in the past 27 years. So it was neat to do it on my first ever trip to an international Disney park. Now, I'm going to preface this next bit with the fact that compared to the US parks, it felt like it cost next to nothing to visit the Tokyo Disney parks. We paid around $270 total for both of us for full day passes to both parks. We could have gone a bit cheaper and done a partial day to Disney Sea. They have an afternoon/evening pass. But I was worried that not being able to get into that park until after 5 p.m. wouldn't allow us enough time there, what with it closing at 9, I think, the night that we visited. Considering a one-day, one-park pass to Disneyland in California has a base price of $180 per person, I did not feel bad that I went into our Tokyo Disney Day knowing that I was going to throw money at everything I could in order to do as much as possible in such a limited amount of time. This meant that we grabbed every premiere pass we could, first for the Beauty and the Beast ride at Disneyland, and later for the Tower of Terror and Journey to the Center of the Earth at Disney Sea. We also snagged free priority passes to Thunder Mountain at Disneyland, and thankfully that park wasn't super crowded, so even though we could only get one each of the premiere and priority passes, we were able to check out quite a few other attractions, including Star Tours, Monsters Inc., the Tiki Room with Stitch, the Roger Rabbit ride, and Pirates of the Caribbean. Plus, the only one we waited more than maybe 10 to 15 minutes for was the Monsters, Inc. ride, which I think was close to a 40-minute wait, which still not bad, though some of that was because that was about as long as I was willing to wait for anything. Of those rides, the Beauty and the Beast ride is just like the Ratatouille ride at Epcot in terms of like mechanism, but it has far better theming. It was definitely worth the premiere pass. I also loved the addition of Stitch to the Tiki Room and wish the US parks would implement that. But also I'm a huge Stitch fan, so maybe that's part of it. As for Pirates of the Caribbean, that was a weird one. Like, of course I had to ride it. It's always been one of my favorite Disney rides, and I did, after all, work at Pirates at Disney World. It was neat that the animatronics were in Japanese, but the ride itself was a weird mix of the versions at Disney World and Disneyland in California. It was longer like the California version, but only had one down drop like the Orlando version. So in the end, it just kind of felt like something was missing. Beyond that, other than the fact that Main Street has the beautiful glass roof and that, of course, they have a few different rides, Tokyo Disneyland is mostly a copy of Disneyland in California. Oh, of course, they have the Disney World Castle, Cinderella's rather than Sleeping Beauty's, but it really isn't all that different. Or maybe I'm not giving the differences enough credit. Well, listing them all out like that does make me feel kind of silly, saying that it feels like a California Disneyland copy. So if somebody wants to debate me on this, you might be able to change my mind. And don't get me wrong, I'm not stating that as a complaint or anything. Listen, I worked at Disney World for nearly 5 years and have been there as a guest almost more times than I can count at this point. So the similarities between Tokyo Disneyland and other parks are maybe of little or really no consequence. In fact, the only complaint, such as it is, that I have about Tokyo Disneyland is about the freaking parades. Part of this is because I'm simply not a theme park parade person. Never have been, never will be. And I specify theme park parades because as much as I love New Orleans, obviously I love the parades there. So because I had no desire to see any of the parades, I didn't think to check the times for them, which meant that I didn't realize there are more parades in Tokyo than in the US parks, including parades in both the early and late afternoon in Tokyo Disneyland. So yeah, my not looking into the parades at all led to us having to first spend a lot longer getting from point A to point B during the morning parade, though at least we were able to eventually reach our destination. And actually, now that I'm talking about this, I'm realizing I forgot to mention we also went on Haunted Mansion, which like Disneyland changes over to the Nightmare Before Christmas theme at this time of year, which I was a little bit disappointed in, but whatever, can't be helped. And then during the afternoon parade, we straight up got stuck in the park for about a half hour longer than we'd wanted or planned to. And I know, true first world problems here. And I also understand that there are cultural reasons that fuel the Tokyo Disney Parks' emphasis on live entertainment, and that it's really only my fault for not checking on parade times, lengths, and routes prior to visiting, blah, blah, blah. But also, 2 parades less than 3 hours apart? Come on. Anyway, when we finally escaped the clutches of that evil second parade, we headed over to Disney Sea, which, as I mentioned in this episode's intro, happened to have opened while I was on my very first Walt Disney World College program. Not that this meant I had really looked into anything about the park, especially as I knew that in choosing to visit during just the second part of the day, we wouldn't be able to get on many rides. I didn't even bother thinking about the possibility of visiting the newest area of the park, Fantasy Springs, because it's like super hard to get into even if you get into Tokyo Disney Sea first thing when it opens. So I will say that I'd heard that Disney Sea is disappointing, which I'm not quite sure I agree with. What I will say is that the park itself seems kind of nonsensical, with the themed areas being called ports and those ports not really being cohesive at all. Sure, most of the ports are on their own really cool, but to me it's giving, let's go overboard to make up for the crappy reviews the park received when it first opened. Granted, we only had time to really explore a few of the ports, and we only got to ride 2 attractions, though I think we were extremely lucky regarding the 2 we were able to purchase premiere passes for. One was, as I already mentioned, Tower of Terror, which was very different from the version at Disney World, though that wasn't the real reason why I chose this premiere pass, because I didn't know about the different theming until we actually went on it. No, I had to choose that Tower premiere pass because when I saw that it was available, I asked Dean if we should bother, assuming that he had to have ridden Tower at Disneyland. He hasn't been there in a really long time, so I know he hasn't gone on the Guardians of the Galaxy version that's there now, but the actual Tower of Terror building and the previous version of the ride has been there forever, so I figured he had to have ridden it at some point. But then he admitted he'd never ridden it at all, so it was a no-brainer that we needed those premiere passes. The wait was also something like 180 minutes, so that was a big nope. The other ride that I've already mentioned we got a pass for was Journey into the Center of the Earth. I hemmed and hawed a bit more about this one because the only information I could really find online was from people saying the ride was really neat, mostly because of, quote, what happens at the end, unquote. But no one would say what happened at the end. And, well, I'm not going to reveal what happens either, because going into this ride knowing everything about it would really take away from the experience as a whole. Suffice to say, it was definitely worth it. If it hadn't been, I would just give a full rundown. Okay, with the ride stuff out of the way, I want to go back to the themed ports we got to explore. The Mediterranean area, which is the main entrance essentially, is of course really cool, but to be honest, not all that much more or different from the Venetian Hotel in Las Vegas, just outdoors instead of indoors. But the American waterfront with the elevated electric trolley and the full-sized SS Columbia ship was the real surprise. Both Dean and I really loved this area, though I'd say it was more his favorite than mine because he was obsessed with exploring the ship. Not that I can blame him. I would have loved to have been able to sit down at the bar and enjoy a relaxing drink and really see more of the inner workings of it. But we didn't want to give up 30 minutes of our time just waiting for a seat. So instead, we spent nearly that much time just wandering around the public areas of the ship. We basically just strolled through Mysterious Island, Lost River Delta, and Port Discovery, but we did spend a little bit more time looking around in both Mermaid Lagoon and Arabian Coast. The former was really cute. I loved the whole indoor play area. Sure, it's made for families with little kids, but the theming and the adorable little attractions are great. Even if you don't have kids, if you make it to Disney Sea, it's worth checking out, especially if you're a Little Mermaid fan, obviously. Arabian Coast, though, wow, I love this area so much. The huge courtyard of the Agrabah Palace with its double-decker carousel, just chef's kiss. We saw it at night, and I definitely think that's the time to see it because it looked so amazing all lit up. I really do wish we'd had more time in general at Disney Sea, but then really I just wish we'd had more time in Japan as a whole. If we had, maybe we would have done 2 full park days, but actually, I don't know. We got to see plenty at both parks, so if you're willing and able to do a full open to close day like we did, you can definitely have a nearly full Tokyo Disney experience. Before I close out this chapter, I do want to touch on a few more things. If you don't know this already, Tokyo Disney is huge on different popcorn flavors and awesome popcorn bucket designs. So yes, I did do a full popcorn bucket search. Sadly though, when I did finally decide on the bucket I wanted, which is Monsters Inc. one that even has little doors all over it that you can open to reveal either the popcorn inside or pictures of characters, plus an adorable Boo sitting on top and a little Randall figure hanging from the strap. The flavor option at the stand where I first found the bucket was white chocolate, and I wasn't in the mood for something so sweet. Thankfully, you can get most, if not all of the buckets at a storefront, but it doesn't have as many flavor choices. So in the end, I went with basic cheddar popcorn. And I really only regret not trying the curry popcorn we eventually saw at Disney Sea. We also had to go basic for our meal options due to time constraints. We had a late breakfast at La Taverne de Gaston, which was decent, but again, nothing special or different. Then we snacked for a lot of the day. Thankfully, other than the popcorn situation, we did try a couple of interesting things, including the alien mochi that you can find at several Tomorrowland restaurants in Disneyland, and these sausage on a bone things from a stand in the American waterfront port at Disney Sea. And I honestly don't know if the bone part was supposed to be edible. I don't think it was, but hey, I could be wrong. I did try biting into it, and it wasn't like an actual bone. Obviously, I wouldn't have been able to bite through it if it was. But in my opinion, it did not have the texture of something that was meant to be digested, so I did not eat it. Unfortunately, by the time we were hungry for like an actual dinner, we were also pushing our time for Journey into the Center of the Earth. So we chose the restaurant that had the shortest lines, Zambini Brothers, which is kind of Italian food that in some cases has a Japanese twist, maybe. Again, it was decent, but nothing special. And again, not having an overly exciting food experience at Tokyo Disney was entirely due to how little time I decided to set aside for meals. And I don't really regret that because less time spent waiting to eat meant more time to see the parks and ride the rides. Somewhat average food experiences aside, other than the parade frustrations from earlier in our day, the only other thing about Tokyo Disney that we ended up side-eyeing really hard was their monorail, which isn't at all like the Disney monorails in the US because it's not free. You pay to ride, and wow, do you pay a premium. As in whether you're going one stop or two, or for some reason riding it all the way around just for funsies, it costs 300 yen per trip. Which sure isn't a lot of money. It's about $2 US, but compare that to the fact that we were taking subways and trains all over Tokyo on our trip for distances way longer than even the entire Disney monorail loop there. And the vast majority of those trips on the public subways and trains cost less than 300 yen, usually quite a bit less. I don't know. The idea of a Disney tax for their pay-to-ride monorail both amused and annoyed me, so I just had to whine about it a little bit here. Overall, though, in case it hasn't been clear, we had an amazing time at Tokyo Disney, and I'm actually really glad that this was my first overseas Disney park experience. I could for sure go into a lot more detail about every little thing we did and saw, but there are still quite a few more things we enjoyed doing in Japan that I want to at least touch on. So I'm going to move on to Chapter 8, a Fukubukuro of Fun. What is a Fukubukuro, you ask? Well, it translates as lucky bag or fortune bag and was the closest Japanese themed term I could find to work into this chapter's title. A chapter that needed to exist so that I could at least give honorable mention to some of the fun things we did on our trip that didn't really warrant an entire chapter all on their own. I'd say this chapter is more like a grab bag than a literal Japanese lucky bag because those are like mystery or blind bags. And of course, I actually know what I'm going to talk about. Or, shoot, maybe that isn't exactly right because who knows what's going to pop into my head as I'm recording this, right? Guess we'll see. Anyway, I think I'll start with, gashapon. These are the capsule toys that you can find in machines all over Japan. And by all over, I mean all over. Like, yes, there are entire stores, for lack of a better term, dedicated to them, but you can find banks of these machines basically everywhere. As a trinket person, it took all of one gashapon purchase to finding ones that either aligned with my interest or that I just thought were cute. Of course, while they're not pricey per se at 200 to 800 yen per capsule, with most of them costing like 300 to 500 yen, it's super easy to rack up the amount of money you spend on these things. So I did my best to rein myself in, though I did come home with, I think, 8 gashapon of my own. Dean bought quite a few for himself as well. And then we also picked up some for the kids and our friends who were going to be with us for Christmas. And listen, if I hadn't tried to rein myself in, it would have been way more. In the end, I think I only spent, I don't know, anywhere from $17 to $20 total on them. And the experience of searching for the machines that held the ones I would want was fun in and of itself. Though I'm still mad that when we wandered into a Monchichi store in Asakusa, we didn't have any coins on us, and so I missed out on getting a Monchichi gashapon. But seriously though, that was absolutely one of the biggest disappointments of the trip, and I don't care how silly that might sound. Honestly, even mentioning that now has me annoyed and sad about it all over again, so instead I'm going to bring up one of the gashapon I did get. In fact, I think it was only the second one. It was a Pokemon gashapon, a Galarian Ponyta that's perched on an ice cream sundae. It's really adorable. And I did see the same machine elsewhere later in the week, but I first found the machine containing it at Pokemon Center Mega. Because as Pokemon fans, and maybe more specifically Pokemon Go fans, obviously we had to carve out time early in the week to visit one of the Tokyo Pokemon centers. And by early in the week, I mean our first full day there, because neither Dean or I wanted to miss out on checking out at least one of these special stores. We chose the Mega one because it was closest to our hotel and also had a Pokemon Go lab. But to be honest, the Go lab was only cool for us because of the professor and the team leader statues. For my part, though, I circled that Pokemon store there a full 2 times, picking out every neat little Eevee thing I could find, Eevee being my favorite Pokemon, of course. And to be fair, I did talk myself out of buying a couple of items that were a bit pricey, but I absolutely got a few Eevee souvenirs that can only be found at cost in Japan, so that made me more than a little bit happy. And side note, yes, we did play Pokemon Go a good amount while we were in Japan. We collected gifts to send to our friends, and we were also trying to snag some of the regional Pokemon, which was, let's say, mostly a success. And I'll leave it at that because if I go into any more detail, this episode is going to be way longer than it needs to be. Another place I wanted to at least mention was the Shinjuku Gyoen National Garden. We actually spent most of our first morning in Japan wandering around this park, which was, not surprisingly, absolutely gorgeous. It originated during the Edo period, which lasted from 1603 to 1868, and it started as a feudal lord's Tokyo residence. And now being a public garden, there is a fee to enter, but it's more than worth it. I wanted to say it was like 500 yen a person, and it's gigantic. It has everything from a large greenhouse to a traditional Japanese landscape garden to formal French and English gardens. And despite it being early December, there were still plenty of flowers blooming. So it was really neat to see those along with some gorgeous fall foliage all in one place. At one point, I even sat down on one of the spacious grassy knolls to just kind of take it all in for a bit. And also, like, let's be real, after such a long flight the day before, well, technically the day before anyway, and our desperate meanderings in very crowded city areas the previous evening while we tried to find our hotel, a lengthy, peaceful stroll through this beautiful park was just what we needed. Speaking of gardens and parks, while it's basically impossible to go inside the Imperial Palace itself, we still made our way there to see what we could. The East Gardens are open to the public, and these ones are free. And they even have some ruins and reconstructed buildings that you can see. We only spent about an hour there because we arrived near closing time, but I'm not sure we would have needed much more time than that. And anyway, this quick stop at the Palace Gardens was also what gave us the best reason to visit Tokyo Station, which outside of being a major transportation hub, has a beautiful exterior and is a veritable maze of shops and eateries inside. And now I'm sitting here trying to figure out how much I want to get into the many other things we did and saw on our trip that I either haven't mentioned or haven't talked about a lot yet. I will say that if anyone who knows me fairly well is listening to this, you're probably shocked that I haven't said much about any sort of nightlife, either in this episode or my first one. Like, yeah, I talked about the amazing cacao themed bar we went to, a great sake bar experience we had, and some of the breweries we saw out and beers we tried, but nothing specific about nightlife. And there's a good reason for that. We did not search it out, at least not really. We went out exactly 3 times, but we also had a couple really early mornings, and we also didn't want to be super hungover for any of the other days. We just had way too many other things we wanted to do and see, and while we did get some good suggestions for bars and nightlife, our time was, precious, I guess. That, and to be quite honest, the idea of navigating public transportation after drinking a bunch, especially with the GPS issues we were having, simply did not appeal. But like I said, we did go out a few times. They just all happened to be in Golden Guy, which, yes, touristy and shit, I know, but it was just a few blocks from our hotel, and we did find a cheesy little karaoke place there that had decently priced drinks and no cover charge. So after spending our first night partying there, we just kept going back to the same spot because it was easy and it was fun. Actually, the first time we wandered into this bar, it was with a friend of ours from California who happened to be wrapping up her trip to Japan. And we had an absolute blast singing karaoke and dealing with random dudes from Jersey who almost started a fight. Just to be clear, the fight was not with us. If it had been, that would obviously be way more of a story. But the second time we wandered up into this bar was less exciting. And then on our final night, we ended up going there yet again the third time. And we actually met this really awesome person who was also from California, which led to some great conversations. So point being, sure, we went out to have some drinks a few nights while we were there, but nightlife wasn't a focus of our trip, at all. Something that was a focus of our trip, well, for Dean anyway, was what sadly ended up being a fruitless search for Transformer and or Gundam figures and toys. And yes, there is a difference between figures and toys, you guys. While this search wasn't what led us to Akihabara, it ended up kind of becoming the focus of our afternoon there. And while I was waiting for my Sensoji Goshuin, Dean also perused some of Asakusa looking for these items. On the other hand, his search was what led us to Nakano Broadway, though as I mentioned in my Best Laid Japlans episode, we ended up finding a nice little sake bar in that area, so at least our evening there wasn't a total wash. And speaking of shopping, well, sort of anyway, we also spent a good amount of time in Harajuku, mainly wandering down Takashita Street, which is, of course, so kawaii. No, but for real, if you want to be blasted with pastels and desserts and storefronts selling experiences like petting piglets and otters, this is your place. And I'm saying that in total seriousness. I actually really enjoyed the window shopping and meanderings here more than I did in Akihabara. We also stumbled on the Tokyo Plaza Harajuku as we exited Takashita Street on our way to grab the subway back to our hotel. This is a super cool building that has one of the top corners carved out for what I can only describe as a sky garden. I'm sure there's an official term for it or whatever, but I like the term sky garden, so that's what I'm going to use. I'm guessing it's not the highest open air garden in Tokyo, like highest up on a building, but it's surely one of the coolest looking ones, both from the outside and inside. And as for the Tokyo Plaza building, it houses quite a few floors of shops, and if I'm remembering correctly, 2 floors of little eateries, and one of the shopping floors even has several art installations on it, so that was really neat to see. I also found a really gorgeous embroidered tote bag there featuring an exclusive design by a Tokyo artist. It, along with my Goshincho and my Maneki Neko statue, is definitely one of my favorite souvenirs from our trip. And on that note, I think it's time for me to wrap up not just this chapter, but this episode. Before I do, though, I have a few tips for anyone thinking of traveling to Japan. First being, before your trip, make sure to register on Visit Japan Web. It can make going through customs upon your arrival quite a bit faster. We were lucky that there wasn't a line at customs at all, but during busier times, there absolutely will be, so it can really help with that. Oh, and definitely make sure you either exchange some US dollars for yen at home or right when you get there, or visit an ATM as early as possible after you arrive. Like maybe not at the airport, as those ones are more likely to charge higher fees, but trust me, you will want cash for street food, gashapon, and more. I also highly suggest bringing or purchasing hand wipes, hand sanitizer, and masks. The wipes and sanitizer because many public bathrooms don't have soap in them. The masks because, well, you'll thank me when you're on a crowded train and someone near you is hacking away and not even covering their mouth. And yes, it happened, I would say, every time we got on public transportation. There was at least one person within 10 feet of us who was coughing away. Nice, nasty, wet coughs usually, and not covering their mouth with anything. Not a hand, not the inside of their elbow, not a handkerchief, nothing. Just coughing into the air. It was great, let me tell you. People are gross. On a somewhat more positive note, though, you won't need any plug adapters like you do if you're going to like Europe, say, unless you're bringing something that has a 3-pronged plug, in which case you'll just need an outlet extender. Just make sure that the extender itself is only 2 prongs. And this also goes for like hair implements. My God, I remember the first time I traveled to Europe with a hair straightener, back in the mid to late 20s when everyone's hair, even if it was already pretty much straight, had to be like pin straight. I took a straightener to Europe, and every time I used it, I was worried about the voltage differences. I did have the adapters and everything needed, but at the time there were still all these warnings about, hey, you could still burn out your straightener even with the proper adapters. So yeah, no worries about that in Japan. I used hair implements while I was there and plugged in all sorts of things. Thankfully, I didn't bring anything with more than 2 prongs. But like say you're bringing your laptop and it has a battery pack and plug that has 3 prongs. You need an outlet extender to plug it into that has a 3-prong, option, because the Japan outlets are only 2. But anyway, I'm sure that if I thought about it for a little longer, I could come up with a lot more to say, because in case it hasn't been obvious, this trip was one of those trips of a lifetime. Though to be fair, isn't any vacation you take to a brand new place that you end up falling in love with one of those? However, I've waxed on quite a bit in this episode, and I had already had a, 40 plus minute long episode with best laid plans. So in conclusion, I'm just going to say thank you for listening to what's only my second travel centric podcast episode ever. As always, if you have any thoughts on personal stories of mine you're interested in hearing, or any particular rants or rambles you'd like me to go on, send me a DM at a Geek Saga on Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, or Threads, or again, email ageeksaga@gmail.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to rate this podcast 5 stars on the podcatcher of your choice, and definitely follow me on the aforementioned social media accounts for the most current news and updates about this series. Also, please consider backing our Patreon at patreon.com/geeksaga_entertainment for early access to not just these Impulsive Hyperfocus episodes, but all other Geek Saga podcast episodes, as well as other content.